Hi, glad you made it. Welcome to Smooth-On's Epoxy Putty presentation. I'm Janessa, and Heather's going to be helping us out today as well from our Smooth-On team. Thank you, Heather. We're actually going to be showing you a little bit about the Epoxy Putty products that Smooth-On makes here in Macungie, Pennsylvania. It's where we're coming to you from today. We have a phenomenal team here at Smooth-On, and they're going to be at the ready to answer questions for you as well, both through our phone number that you can call, as well as through email. If you have any questions throughout this presentation, feel free to dive in. I'd be happy to answer anything I can, as would anyone here at Smooth-On. So to get started, Smooth-On has many different products: mold rubbers, casting resins, foams, all kinds of different chemistries, from tin silicones and platinum silicones to urethanes and epoxies. The products we're going to be looking at today, and I'm going to be showing you how they work throughout the next hour and a half, so stay tuned, are actually going to be mixed by hand. So these are epoxy chemistries, and they're putties, they're hand mix. So they're not materials that you brush on or that you pour. We're going to be mixing with our hands, and that means we're also going to be using personal protective equipment. You're going to see me putting on gloves throughout the presentation. We have some really good ventilation here, but I do have my safety equipment, which is always really important in case I need to protect my eyes, or I have a respirator ready as well, because we are going to be working with epoxies, and personal safety is always really important when you're working with the materials. If you ever have any questions about those as well, the documents, the recommendations for use are actually available on the Smooth-On website. There are instructions there, as well as videos and photo galleries showing you how these materials work too. But I'm going to show you what I love about them, and we're going to get started looking at the Freeform Sculpt product. I really love sculpture, and sculpture is a big topic. There are a lot of different ways people think about sculpture. Some of you might be sculptors yourselves. These materials can be used for a wide variety of different projects, not just sculpture. But to start with, let's kind of get on the same page on what sculpture is. Again, that's a big topic. I can't possibly hope to cover everything, but I can say that for the sake of what we're talking about here, there are two main approaches, one of which is additive sculpture, when you're building up material to make your shape, and then subtractive sculpture, when you're carving into your form to actually take away material. So some of you might be familiar with armatures. Armatures are actually used, and you might even be used to thinking about flexible ones to help get your poses. They're used to hold up your piece, because whenever you're making something in the world, gravity's acting on it, and the different materials that are used to create different effects may need a foundation. So armatures do a few different things. They do help you create a pose and shape it. They also help build up mass. And so just to give you an idea, I have an example here where it still has a pose, but there's more material on it. And this is our Freeform Air. We're going to talk about this in just a little bit. I'm going to show you how you can mix this material and build up mass very quickly. The thing I want you to know about these epoxy putties right off the bat is that they actually cure at room temperature. So what we're going to be talking about here are materials two-part systems that go together. In fact, let me get started and mix some for you. And they cure rigid. The really neat thing about that, because you're not working with heat, you're just working with room temperature, is that you can build on all kinds of different armatures. Some of them could be very involved. In this case, you can see the materials are used right on top of aluminum. But there are more humble ways to build armatures. I'm just going to take some aluminum foil. And I can use this to make a mass to shape on top of as well. So even though this armature is already set and mounted to a base, there's nothing stopping me from just mixing some material and creating a shape. So let's get started with that. The Freeform Sculpt is an epoxy putty that's very adhesive, and it's a neutral gray appearance. It's actually what you see used in this example. When we were talking about the sculpture techniques, this is an example more of an écrochet process where material is added up to simulate not just the pose, but then muscle and then skin on top of it, so it's worked in layers. And we can mix up some freeform sculpt and do something very similar right now. So I'm going to start with the part A and the part B. This is actually dispensed out 1-to-1 by volume. So as you can see, I'm not using any additional equipment. And then I'm going to press those together and mix. Now, I tend to mix pretty vigorously, but what I'm looking for is for that part A and part B to combine to create one uniform appearance. And now I'm on the clock. So I've started the pot life for this material. And I tend to dispense out with the freeform sculpt enough material that I can mix by hand. I don't want to take too much material, otherwise they would be larger than my hand size. It is actually mass sensitive, so it's going to cure faster in a great big thick mass than it would in a thin section. So if you want more working time, a great way to get that is actually to spread your material out thin to help maximize how much time you have to work with it. And those two colors are blending together really nicely for me. I'm just going to keep going a little bit more. Mixing that part A and part B in that two-part system. So for me, it actually has a hand fill very similar to that of an oil-based clay, even though it's an epoxy putty. It's very easy to move and shape and manipulate. And I almost have a complete mix. Just a little bit more, so that I don't see any division between those two colors, and it's all one nice uniform gray appearance. Now, the further into the pot life this material gets, the firmer it's going to be. When it's soft and newly mixed is actually the best time to add color to it, and you can color this material. The freeform sculpt can be colored with the UVO epoxy colorants. We're actually going to take a little bit of this material too and add some color to it so I can show you. And now it's all mixed. I'm spreading it out to see if I have any lines or divisions, but I don't see any. It's one uniform gray appearance. That's what I'm looking for. Great. So now I can wait further into the pot life for it to get firmer if I wanted to carve into it. But now's a good time when it's nice and soft to add that color. So we're going to go ahead and add some UVO. I'm just going to set this down for a moment and change out my gloves now that I've mixed the material. And I'm going to add that colorant, which is our UVO. We're going to make one darker color so I can show you the difference between the lines. One of the really neat things about coloring it intrinsically is that if you carve into it, or if you were to cut pieces, that color is going to go all throughout. So I have some colored examples here on the table with the freeform sculpt and UVO colorant. And then I have some that have actually been cut through so that you can see that color going all the way through the example, as opposed to just painting the surface. Although they do handle paints really, really well. So let us take some of that newly mixed freeform sculpt. I'm just going to divide it in half just so I have a small amount. And add that UVO colorant to it. A little bit goes a long way, so it won't take much. Then I'm going to fold that in. Again, a good reason to be wearing gloves So I'm not getting color on me, I'm just getting them on the gloves and in the material. And I'm looking, again, to mix that color all the way through. This is actually a really nice way to make pieces to be able to see, if you are a sculptor who's carving into the material, how thick your layers are by coloring them and rolling them out. But it's also a neat way to blend colors together. So I'm going to show you what that looks like, and then I'm going to show you a cured example. So I don't see any gray anymore. I just see the black all the way through. Actually, let me set that down just a moment. Change out my gloves. Because I mix this material, the freeform sculpt, at the same time, it has the same pot life on both sides. It's just one side has been colored. I'm going to mix those together. And the reason I want to show you that is because now I can get all kinds of different color effects if I was using it for a jewelry example, or to show you how that color went all the way through in that example you saw before. So I'm just going to blend that together a little bit.
Hey, Janessa.
Yes.
Quick question. Somebody's asking the basics of why you would use an epoxy putty versus an oil-based clay.
Okay, great. That's a fantastic question. So the question is, why would somebody use an epoxy putty versus an oil-based clay? Well, one of the reasons I'm using it, like in the example here, is if I want it to actually go from being a soft material to a rigid material. An oil-based clay tends to be shapeable. It doesn't experience a chemical reaction that causes it to go from a soft material to a hard material. But I do use the oil-based clay as a filler, and I can show you how to do that so that you can maximize your working time and get a firmer material right off the bat. If this is too soft for you, everybody has their own way of working with tools and their own techniques, and I can show you one that's pretty neat. But just to give you an idea of how that marble effect happened with the color, you can see now that those colors go all the way through this example. And I hope that answered your question, but I am going to show you just a little bit more. That was a great question about how you can supplement with an oil-based clay as well. So with this color, you can actually see that it swirls with the movement of my hand, so I have a lot of control over how that shape and form goes. Because it cures at room temperature, I can actually change the position of my piece to allow it to cure vertically if I want that to stay very, very straight. And if I wait until it's firmer, I can actually shape it a little bit just before it gets to this point. So I'm really sculpting with time to help maximize the control I have over the freeform sculpt. Pardon me, I'm just going to take a drink for a second. And let me show you how that oil-based clay can be used. So as it is, this material is a little softer because we just mixed it. We're at the start of the pot life. And as such, I'm not going to be able to carve into it as readily, but I can get some really phenomenal detail out of it. So you might be wondering what tools you might want to work with this. Well, I recommend wood tools because it actually can be smoothed and shaped with water, and it captures phenomenal detail. So I'm actually just going to smooth that out, and I have some water here. Just spray it a little bit, and that'll let me really beautifully smooth that surface. And then I can use my tools. So I've got all kinds of sculpting tools. I tend to use disposable tools because the material is very adhesive and I don't want the freeform sculpt epoxy to stick to it, but I can actually use water just to move that tool over the surface and get a really nice line. Now, if I don't want it to stick to my tools, so just going to use that aluminum foil we had earlier as a texture, I can spray it with the Freeform Detailer, which is a liquid solution Smooth-On offers to keep it from sticking to surfaces, and just press it right in. So you can see that epoxy putty has a really nice high density that can capture some really extraordinary detail. But, so as I was saying, for some artists this might be too soft for you. So if you want to get as much working time out of it as you can, you might take an oil-based clay. So this one's Sculpt X. It's sulfur-free oil-based clay. And the super soft one, I can actually take the same visual amount, 1-to-1, of that Freeform Sculpt that we mixed, and blend those together as a filler to help maximize the working time so that it is going to make it a little less adhesive. It might change the color just a little bit, but it blends in really easily. And I can use it as a filler so that right off the bat, the Freeform Sculpt is firmer. And I have more time to work my detail into it. Again, just like before, I'm making sure I have as complete a mix as possible. I don't want to leave any of that clay exposed, because the clay itself isn't going to go from a flexible material to a rigid. But I'm going to show you an example compared to this real soft form. Now that the Sculpt X has been worked into it, even though these have the same pot life, this one has a filler. Well, I'll just give you a really simple example. Now it's going to not experience the same level of distortion because the material's already firmer because of that integration of the filler. I could also wait. I could wait a half hour and work with it when the material's gone further into its pot life and it's not as soft. But this gives me a whole nother, half hour, for example, to work with a material at room temperature while it's still soft like this before it starts to become rigid and carvable.
Question about adding that in. Does it create a softer piece when it's finished? And does it affect the cure aside from the time? Will the final piece still be rigid?
Okay, so the question is, with the integration of the oil clay as a filler, the sulfur-free oil clay, the Sculpt X I used, will it still cure rigid? Yes. I don't recommend going above that 1-to-1 by-volume mix ratio because you want to make sure that you get a really complete mix and you don't want any of that clay exposed. So as long as it's fully mixed in, it will cure to a rigid result. However, in terms of how the material works, it does break a little bit easier. It doesn't elongate as much as the unfilled material, the Freeform Sculpt, just as it starts out. And I want to tell you, even with the oil-based clay in, you can build it up in layers. The Freeform Sculpt will actually stick to itself really nicely so that you can make multiple batches and add on, which is what happened in these examples so that I could build up a piece over time. And sometimes I actually like, although having a flexible pose and making it rigid can be a really phenomenal step to hold the weight. Like, for example, if I wanted to, I could take the oil-based clay and build it up on top and create a clay surface piece on that rigid armature to hold that weight. There's a phenomenal video that Milo did here at Smooth-On that I recommend checking out so that you can see a similar process if you were making a mold of that shape and you wanted it to hold the weight of the clay. You can do that as well, or you can actually add layers of the Freeform Sculpt. And as I said, this is the Freeform Air, which I'm going to demonstrate next. So hold on, we're going to get there in just a moment. The Sculpt and the Air do stick to each other beautifully. They do bond really well. So the answer to the question is yes, it cures rigid. You want to make sure you have a complete mix. Sometimes you might notice a slight color difference from the incorporation of the clay. So it does have some different characteristics, but in terms of adding it to the Freeform Sculpt and continuing to work, it still bonds really nicely.
One more quick point that somebody was asking about, I think it's a good question, is what are the advantages of using Freeform Sculpt versus some of the other epoxy putties that are out there?
That's a fantastic question. So the question is, compared to other epoxy putties out there, what are the advantages of Freeform Sculpt? I find that in terms of working with it compared to competitor materials, and I've worked with a wide range of different epoxies. In fact, we're going to look at some of them today. But one of the features is that when I said you can extrude it out, that it elongates really nicely, you can actually run the Freeform Sculpt through an extruder. This is the only epoxy I know of that I can actually do that with very, very, very fine detail. So the level of detail and control is wonderful. It also is very soft when it's first mixed, which is a real advantage if you're seaming or connecting parts. So especially if you are adhering material to a surface, like let's say you have a casting and it had bubbles in it or voids, and normally you would throw that casting away. Well, with the Freeform Sculpt, you can, because it's so adhesive, you can fill in those gaps, sculpt on top of it, so it adheres really well to the urethane plastic. So there are different features in terms of like coloration and different products out there. I don't want to get into specifics in like exact comparisons, but the technical information on the Freeform Sculpt is actually available on our website, so you can look at some of those in terms of the hardness and the observed tested values. I'd say that the adhesion is a really strong point. So I have a few surfaces here that the Freeform Sculpt is adhered to. So this is just a very inexpensive ceramic tile. I think from a hardware store I was looking at about like $1.50, you know, and then I elevated it to a relief piece by adding layers of the Freeform Sculpt onto it. Sometimes I like working on top of reference material. In this case, I actually put the reference material underneath the surface so that I could actually, you know, slide it out and move it and sculpt on top of it so that I could see that reference really easily. As you can see, this is on an incline and it adhered very well. But also the neutral color on the Freeform Sculpt makes it incredibly easy to paint. I was telling you that it's very easy to paint with like acrylic paints. This piece doesn't actually have any primer on it. The paint just, the acrylics went right on top of it. And as you can see, it's very firmly attached to that base. So that's another way in which when you're building up those layers, that adhesion can really work to your advantage. So I hope that helped answer your question a little bit. But we're going to compare some of the properties of why you might use one putty over another, which I think you're going to really love when we get to that freeform air. I do want to say that when the epoxy is fully cured, and I've tested this with the clay that I showed, that's why I used a sulfur-free clay, I have been able to make platinum cure silicone molds off of it. This is the Mold Star 16 platinum silicone is used in this example. And then once you have that mold made, then you can make castings. So this is the original, made with that Freeform Sculpt, and actually an acrylic glossy spray was applied to it to get that that high gloss that then came out beautifully in the castings. So when I said you can apply it in layers, here's an example, right? Very clearly you can see different layers have been mixed and it does stick to itself very well. But I did want to show you when I was talking about coloring, why you might color the material. You can actually, if you do carve into it, by rolling out layers in controlled thicknesses, when you cut into it, you can use that as a framework. I don't know how many of you out there are wood carvers or stone carvers, or I know that this is a technique that's even used, again, for jewelry applications, but it gives you a baseline to practice with where you have more control over the shape you're starting with. You do want to make sure that you wear protective equipment if you're carving into the material with like a rotary tool, so that you're not breathing in the epoxy particles when you're working with it. But this is the Freeform Sculpt, and when I just want to review the tools one last time, I actually recommend wood tools, and one of those reasons is because they're disposable. So if I get material on my tool, I'm not wrecking an expensive, custom-made metal tool. I'm actually just dipping the wood in some water so that it very easily can be applied to the surface, and I can create all kinds of textures because of the level of detail that this material picks up. So do we have any other questions about the Freeform Sculpt product or the Freeform Detailer before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, a question that came up a little while ago was, durability of these pieces once they're cured for things like cosplay, or if you have it on a costume and they get, you know, banged around or knocked into. These are really high strength epoxies. I think Sculpt is probably the most strong of all these epoxy putties, if you agree.
So the question is regarding the strength of the freeform Sculpt, especially for impact-resistant applications. The material does cure rigid, so that means in a thin section, it's still brittle and it can still break. And that's actually something I use to my advantage in this piece in a thin section, because then I could break it and repose it and add more material. So in a thin section, yes, that's going to be more evident. In a thicker section, it's not going to be as easy to break the material, and it is very high performance. Now, again, for me, that can be an advantage for some sculpting techniques, but in terms of the epoxy putties that Smooth On offers, there is actually a semi-rigid option that we're going to talk about that has more impact resistant. That's in the Freeform Habitat series, so I can show you that example. And in which case, that would actually bend and flex a little bit more as opposed to breaking and being more brittle in a thin section. So there are also other ways to add some strength to the material, and we're going to look at some of those epoxy products that work in tandem with the putties too, specifically our Epoxymite series, which can be used to laminate fiberglass or carbon fiber to add strength to a thin sectioned epoxy part. So with that said.
One more quick thing before we move on.
Yep.
I know there are customers that are turning our epoxicast resins, pourable epoxies, on lathes and doing milling and things like that. Do you know of anybody who's using like freeform Sculpt as a material to be turned on a lathe, or to, you know, do like a CNC carving application with?
That's a great question. So the question is the freeform Sculpt used for lathe turning applications or CNC carving? I would actually recommend the Freeform Air over the Freeform Sculpt for the CNC carving applications. It's a little softer, it's a little easier to carve. You can carve into the Freeform Sculpt, even if I was just to take a sharp edge to carve in detail. We were talking about a Dremel tool or a rotary tool a little while ago to cut into the material as well. So I'd always say I recommend a small test with your tools to practice with. So it can be carved, it can be cut. I mean, as I was saying, this is actually tooled to get that nice straight edge. So you can carve it with the materials, but because it's mixed by hand and it's pressed together, you are likely to get voids when you do this. Because of the action of the material folding together, you aren't going to get as consistent a solid piece as if you were using a poured material, such as some of the products in the Epoxicast series, which are also being used for those types of applications. So if you are looking to have that control over it, and you want those voids, that's great. That's something I'd recommend trying out. But if it's something that you want to be a solid casting, I would recommend the pourable over the putty for that type of application. All right, well, thank you for staying with me for that. Why don't we move on so I can show you the Freeform Air. I am a big fan. So the Freeform Air is a lighter weight, lower density epoxy putty. And we just looked at the Freeform Sculpt, the Freeform Detailer, the UVO colorants, just to review what we just did. The Sculptex Soft was the oil-based sulfur-free clay that we used as a filler. And I'm going to show you the incorporation of metal powders with these epoxy putties next. So specifically, I have some bronze powdered examples too to be able to show you. And I do want to mention, we were talking about that safety equipment before we move forward, that if you find you do get the material in your hands, we actually, Smooth On does offer an epoxy cleaner, which is a really great way to remove the uncured material from surfaces as well. So I do actually recommend checking that out to supplement the tools that you're using and working with. So speaking of safety equipment and keeping material off our hands, I'm going to go ahead and put on another set of gloves. Now, I don't want to confuse you between the differences with the Freeform Sculpt and the Freeform Air. I do want to mention that the Freeform Air has several different products in the series. So when you're looking at one over the other, they do have quite a few options to choose from. But I do want to show you a comparison of just the Freeform Air first, which is a lightweight, low-density epoxy putty, to the Freeform Sculpt. So with those armatures you saw before, the Freeform Air was used because it's lighter weight. It actually even floats on water. So that's a cured example of the Freeform Air. This is the Freeform Sculpt you're just looking at. That's not going to float. That's much higher density, and it has a finer particle size. It's also more rigid when it's cured than the Freeform Air, which I believe cures to a 50 D durometer, so slightly more flexible. So if you're looking at those carving processes or CNCing processes, that's where I'd recommend this one, the Freeform Air over the Freeform Sculpt. Now, the Freeform Air is going to give you the longest working time when it's mixed, but we also now have the Freeform Air Fast. I want to show you both and where these might add to your toolbox. So to start with, I'm going to mix up the Freeform Air that you just saw float in that last example. It's 1-to-1 by volume, so I'm going to take out the same amount of part A and the same amount of part B visually. So I'm trying to get those as close as I can, and then I'm going to press those together and mix. And just like before with the Freeform Sculpt, you keep that together. I'm looking for that part A and part B to combine to one uniform gray. You can also use UVO to color the Freeform Air products too. But I found that it actually works incredibly well with the metal powders. There is a type of casting which is called cold casting or bonded bronze, where the plastic resin is actually mixed with a metal powder. And like I was saying, how these materials can be used for repairs, you can also use it infusing the metal powder into it to make repairs that can polish and patina just like metal, only made at room temperature. But before we dive into that, you can see how soft and easy it is to mix the Freeform Air. We already have a complete mix and are ready to start sculpting with this. Now, because this material is lower density and it doesn't have as fine a particle size, I don't actually recommend using those fillers we were talking about before with this material, just the metal powders are the ones that I found that work the best. So that oil-based clay was something that I would recommend just with the Freeform Sculpt. I wouldn't recommend with the Freeform Air. It kind of reminds me of sculpting marshmallow without the stick. It's very, very lightweight, very low density. So it's really unique and very easy to use for a wide range of applications beyond sculpting and shaping. For example, making lightweight support shells very quickly and easily by pressing on the material. So it goes from that very soft material to that lightweight, rigid material, and that actually helps you reduce the weight of your support shells as well. So this material here is going to cure nice and rigid, but a little softer than some of the other putties we're going to go into and compare to. And then the metal powder I was telling you about, this is actually an example with the Freeform Air, and I'm just going to take this lid off so you can see it, with a very fine bronze powder mixed in while it's nice and soft like this, so that it actually gives you a result that looks and feels like bronze but isn't as heavy, but can be polished up to create a piece that looks like a bonded bronze. It's just not poured, it's actually hand-shaped. So this is multiple layers, just like we were talking about before, sculpted and built up to get that end result. And then there are a range of different powders from brass and copper, nickel, silver, and aluminum. I actually use the brass to create, and that adhesion to create a really nice effect to feature those adhesive properties on a piece that otherwise would have been discarded. So the freeform air that we just mixed, we can use as an adhesive, we can use as a shaping material, we can use it to make support shells, and we're going to talk about ways to make stronger, lightweight support shells. Actually, why don't we dive into that now? So I have an example here with the freeform air, and this actually has a product called Epoxy, which is saturating it. So we're talking about ways to add strength to the material. So it's still a support shell, just like you saw here with just the freeform air, but in this case, the epoxy is used to make it stronger, so that if this mold was dropped, it's less likely to break and adds additional strength. The freeform air is actually compatible with another product in our series, which is called, so this is just the epoxy, just in a thin section part, but the freeform air can actually be used for the compositing industry to do what's called filleting, so to fill in what would have been layer after layer after layer of application of reinforcement. And then you see another material on here, which I'm going to show you some examples of, is our epoxy coat. This actually lets you capture a whole lot more detail out of your surface. Because as you see, some of these castings have actually been pressed into molds. But when you press the material in, you don't get as much detail as if you were going to use a pourable material. So you can use the epoxy coat, epoxy, brush on epoxy material to get more detail out of your surface and then back it with the freeform air to get your thickness. So in terms of a compositing application, to help create a part with a controlled thickness that you hand shape, whether that's to make a tool or a mold or even a rigid mold, you can actually use the freeform air as part of that process. There are different materials in the freeform air series. One of them is higher temperature, depending on the needs of your tool. So that's where I was saying there are some comparisons we can look at. The first comparison I want to show you, though, is a faster setting pot life. So in the thinnest section, we have observed with the freeform air, you can actually get a 120-minute pot life. I believe that's at 1/8 of an inch or less. But the freeform air fast will actually set up much faster for you, so you can move continuously when you're building up that armature or if you're doing a repair. So I want to mix up some freeform air fast and show a 3D print repair, as these materials actually work on top of a range of different substrates, including EPS foam or 3D prints. So if I wanted to maximize how much time I have to work with this, I can actually roll this out even thinner, reduce that mass, so I can get even more working time out of it. So you'll see on there those pot lives and cure times are dependent on how thick you have that mass. But this is the freeform air, so you can see we have lots of time still to work with it. It has a longer pot life and cure time. The freeform air fast is going to set up much quicker for us, so I'm going to mix that, start that pot life and cure time now. Same as before, I'm just going to grab some part A and part B. By volume, so I'm eyeballing it. I'm looking for that same amount of that part A and part B, and then I'm going to combine them. And at a 1/2 inch thickness, I believe you have 6 minutes at room temperature to work with this material before it's going to start to go into its gel state and get firmer and no longer be flexible. Now, I find that the freeform air fast, it actually, you can use the freeform detailer to get detail out of your surface, but it works very, very well with isopropyl alcohol. So we're going to use some isopropyl alcohol to smooth it out, and we're just going to apply it to seam a 3D print. And that mixed very quickly, so now I'm still on the clock. I'm in the pot life where it's going to start to go from a flexible to a solid material. I am changing my gloves because I don't want any unmixed material getting into our repair. So I would use this as an adhesive for a part where I might have a void that I need to fill, where a standard adhesive wouldn't be enough, because I'm not just connecting a part, I'm actually filling in the connection between. So I have a part here where multiple pieces of a 3D print were applied, and let me go grab a wood tool. I'm just going to take a little bit of that freeform air and spread that onto my surface. And so we offer a really neat 3D print coating, which is called XTC 3D, which settles in to help coat your surface. But for something that has big voids like this, it might accentuate those voids instead of filling it in flat, where with the freeform air fast, I can go in and shape it and smooth it and get, again, a lightweight part. I'm actually going to smooth this out with that isopropyl alcohol, just like I was telling you about, spraying a little bit there on my surface to fill in those cracks in the print that's very low resolution and have more control over that seam to get that nice and smooth. Now I'm just using hand feel, but I can actually use those wood tools, scrape that into the grooves, make sure that's nice and flush. And it is compatible with the XTC 3D. I can actually add it on top of it, or I can do the XTC 3D over the top if I wanted to work with it once it's cured. So you can see now that gap in between isn't there any longer, and I can finesse that, or I can let this set up and then add another layer after that has gone rigid. So because this is a thinner section, this is a more reduced mass, it's going to take a little longer for that to set up, but not as long as if I was using the freeform air. So this really does help me move my working time forward. I'm actually going to create a little bit of a ball with these two materials. They actually can be used together. So let me divide this in half. To get the most working time, you usually want to do this right after you've mixed it. But this is my freeform air fast. This was the initial freeform air that I mixed. We can check back in on this in a little bit so we can see if we're still in the pot life of the freeform air compared to the fast. So I don't want this to be more than a ½ an inch. So I'm just going to press that down a little bit, but let's see. I want the same by volume. So 1:1 by volume. These actually do integrate really beautifully in together after the material. So I mixed both the freeform air and the freeform fast. And the advantage here is this can actually let me customize my working time a little bit, and it will cure faster by integrating the two, but give me more working time than if I was just doing the fast. So I wanted to show you this because it allows for some really great customization depending on the scale of your project. If your project is very, very large and you need more working time, then you might want something that has a longer pot life. So you can kind of dial it in so that you can have a more continuous workflow. So I'm going to put this one right in the middle of the two. We have a nice mix, nice even mix on that, and we'll check back in on that in about 15 minutes and see where we're at. Let me clear some of this. So you can tool this. Like the freeform sculpt, I'll show you what I mean. It just it doesn't capture the detail as fine as the sculpt does, but with the isopropyl alcohol, you can actually use it to sculpt and shape too. Let me go ahead and cut lines into it so you can see a little bit of that definition. Or smooth it out. It does both. Smooths beautifully. There you go. So as far as the freeform air goes, I think Well, I do want to show you because it's one thing to hear me say it, it's another thing to actually see it. When I said it can work on top of foam, this is a set of horns that were made out of the freeform air. So for a cosplay application or something where you wanted something extremely lightweight, but to hold its shape and form. I actually broke off this one to show you that I can build up more or change the contours of it, but also that the foam, this is just a straight styrofoam, goes all the way through without actually breaking down the foam at all. The other thing I want to show you about it is when you're sculpting with these materials, especially in layers, you really just need that surface coat on there to keep it from going in and compressing down that, that form. If you have a substrate that's, very soft, like in this case, with a foam, whether it's an EPS or an EVA foam, something that can very easily compress or get damaged. I always recommend doing like kind of an initial layer to get a rigid surface if you want to build up on top of it. So you wait for this to go from its gel state from its like flexible after you've mixed it. Let it go through its cure time and get rigid so that you don't accidentally deform the layer underneath when you add more. So this is a really thin section part, and that helps keep it really lightweight. But then I can paint right onto it or adhere mixed media to be able to even wear it for a costuming application. And then when I was telling you about the epoxy coat, I do want to mention this is the epoxy coat gray that I showed you. There are a lot of different epoxy coat products in the series. This is just the gray with the freeform air, and then this is the red. It's compatible with the different epoxy coat and epoxymite products. So kind of figuring out which one works best for you. There's some incredible comparison tools on the Smooth On website, so you can actually look at those products side by side. So it's under the support option. There's a material comparison tool that you can take a look at and actually pick these different products to look at those key differences. But I hope this gives you some ideas of ways you could help save a 3D print. Like this one actually stopped midway in the process, and then the adhesive allowed it to create a finished part. But I could also use the freeform air to sculpt on top of it and make a totally different shape, and then make a mold from there and cast it up into something more impact resistant or flexible. I do want to show one last example that's a combination of the freeform air and freeform sculpt before we move on. This is actually, I was talking about that EPS foam. This dolphin was made on top of an EPS foam that was filled in with the freeform air, and then the freeform sculpt gave the detail on top. I actually sanded it back so you could see the air underneath, and then the teeth were actually made with the freeform sculpt, but because it's adhesive, they could just be applied directly without needing to be glued or anything like that. So this is much lighter weight and easier to handle because it has the freeform air inside, but then it has the detail on top with the freeform sculpt that you saw initially. So the two materials do work really well hand in hand. And that was all I was going to show you to start with the freeform air. Do we have any questions before we move on to another product?
Yeah, using materials for a base for putting freeform over. Do you know of anything that wouldn't be compatible? I can't imagine, because epoxy cures on pretty much everything, including in some cases underwater. I've never run into an issue where somebody had a base material that was incompatible with the epoxy.
Right, so the question is, are there any compatibility issues? I will say that because of the greater are there any known substrates that create compatibility issues with the freeform air or epoxy putties that we've been talking about? I haven't seen any where it didn't cure against it, but I will say that if you have a greater mass of material, it's going to generate more heat, and that additional heat can affect the substrate underneath it. Also, if your surface is very porous, it's going to create like more of a mechanical bond and push into that surface. If that's not something that you want, then you would want to close off that porosity and use a release agent. That's really important if you're making multi-part shells where the epoxy is going against itself. So we talked about how it can bond to itself really well in layers, but if that's not something you want, you can actually use appropriate release agents to keep that from happening. But in terms of substrates, the only thing that I've seen is like if I had a wax surface that was just like a solid sheet wax, and I had a thicker piece, depending on the temperature of the wax, where it could soften under the heat. That's the only time I've seen something come up where I might have deformation. But the putty still cured beautifully hopefully. So I can mention that from personal experience. But were there any other questions anybody had that? All right, then. I do want to say that with the different freeform air products, none of them are flexible. So there are different densities, different hardnesses, different characteristics. But when someone was asking about impact resistance, keep in mind these materials are all still going to be rigid when they cure. But we can move on and look at, again, more options for that. But by using the epoxy coat to get more detail and the epoxamite to add strength, you can help create a stronger, thinner part even though the material is more rigid. Okay, so let's move on to the next material and review the ones that we just took a look at. So I was telling you about that material comparison tool, but we have some of the freeform air products up here on a slide for you to be able to take a look at. We mixed the freeform air and we mixed the freeform air fast. There are two other products in that series that we didn't take a look at, and that's the Freeform Air HT and the Freeform Air Fire Safe. I mentioned those as well if you're doing large-scale products and you need a fire-safe material, or if you're looking for a part that's less likely to experience any kind of distortion underneath heat. So let's scale up, right? We were looking at materials that you mix by hand that fit in your hands, right? The freeform Sculpt and the freeform air, I'm looking at batches where I'm just hand mixing. Those materials might be challenging to create a larger effect with. So we're going to move on to our freeform habitat products, which allow you trowelable options to cover larger surfaces and be able to shape and detail. And we're going to talk about ways that you can do that as well. So this is right on top of a PVC surface, since we were talking about different substrates. The freeform habitat black, the freeform habitat fire safe are the two different products we're going to take a look at. We're going to mix some because this actually has a third component. So even though it's a two-part system, there's an extra third component that helps us mix the freeform habitat. And that is the folding powder. And the folding powder helps us reduce adhesion, especially to our hands when we're working with it, but it also helps us thicken the material to get it to a viscosity that's ideal for us to work with, especially over larger shapes. Again, I'm going to put on gloves. But when I mix this time, I'm actually going to be dispensing out the part A and the part B into the folding powder itself. So the trial size unit does come with a third component, that folding powder that you see here, which will thicken the freeform habitat as well. And so again, when you're looking at it, we have two different products on the table, the freeform habitat fire safe and the freeform habitat black. The black has the faster pot life. The fire safe gives you a little bit more working time, and it's more neutral in appearance. So if you do find that you're going to color or mix the material, it's a little easier because you're not working against that black. So it kind of looks a bit more taffy, right, than what we were just mixing. So it is higher density, but it's softer. It is still 1-to-1 by volume. So I'm going to dispense out an eyeball, approximately that same visual amount of part A and part B, right into the folding powder. Now, if I were just to reach in with my gloves, this would stick to my hands because it's very adhesive, which is why I'm just using some wood tools just to kind of eyeball that amount. But once I start working with the folding powder, then I'm going to be able to handle it by hand. Right. So that was my part A, and now dispensing out my part B. And I'm just looking for roughly the same visual amount of that A and B. I'm going to do just a little bit more. I'm real close, though. Okay, there we go. So I have that folding powder. Same material that you see. I already prepped some in here, ready to go, so it's not sticking to my mixing container. Just pour a little bit on top. Get some on my hands, and then I'm just going to fold in that A and B together. Similar to what we hand mixed earlier with the Freeform Sculpt and the Freeform Air, we're looking for that to become one uniform appearance. I don't want to see those differences in color. I want a complete mix, but it is already starting to thicken a bit and become more dough-like because the folding powder is thickening it. I just don't want to push through the material to expose like underneath the folding powder. That would cause it to stick to my gloves, so that's why I'm just kind of kneading the surface. Again, I tend not to mix much more than I can handle because I am going to be pressing it on my surface and shaping it. And that's where we're going to start to talk about a different kind of tool than we talked about before, and that's texture stamps. So I'm going to shape this not with one of my wood tools or sculpting tools, but with a flexible silicone stamp to keep it from sticking to the surface and to control the detail that I get. So I'm looking to see that I have a complete mix. I don't see any of those lines that I was looking for. And you can see where I've exposed it. It's a little tackier, but it's not nearly as sticky as it was before. Oh, I just exposed a little bit underneath. And that's sticking to my gloves, so I'm just going to go one more time. Then I'm going to apply this to my surface, which in this case is just a cup. Because you can apply this to a range of different substrates and work much larger and much faster, this is a really fantastic option too for habitats and aquarium applications. I'm going to show you a texture stamp that actually is going to give us an option to use for aquariums. So I'm just going to smooth this out a little bit so that I don't have cracks in my piece. You can see it's really easy to shape and distort by hand. And that folding powder, well, let me go ahead and change my gloves, isn't going to get in the way of the texturing. I'm going to use that isopropyl alcohol, just spray some on the surface. I tend to prefer to spray it on my stamp, although you can spray it directly on the material surface so that when I press and distort, the isopropyl alcohol, I can go deep into that material. So this is Rebound 25, is this texture stamp that I'm using. I'm applying this to the Freeform Habitat Fire Safe. And I'm just using it as a flexible texture to create a brain coral. That I could then use for an aquarium or habitat. I'm just going over those cracks again with a little bit of pressure, so I don't want to overwork my piece. Oh, a nice detailed surface. This allows me to work really quickly in that pot life, which for this material is 90 minutes, and have control over my shape and my texture. I might work around the piece a little bit. And if I feel like there's any sticking, then I'll just reapply the isopropyl alcohol. Give it another go. There you go. Great. So that one is still in its pot life, right? Very flexible. We just were able to shape it really easily. This one's all cured up. So it's going to cure pretty hard. Now the Habitat series, though, does have a semi-rigid option, which the Habitat Flex FR, which I'm going to show you in just a moment. But these two are rigid, the Habitat Black and the Habitat Fire Safe. Now, with the texture stamp, and we're going to go over texture stamps next because they are really cool tools, and I want you to know how to be able to make them and use them. I want something that has a little bit of flexibility so that when I have a texture that is repeating, that you don't see a delineation between where each application is. I'm hand shaping it and working it, so I want it to look continuous, especially with organic forms like this. If you had something that was a little firmer in that silicone, it could make a really fantastic mold, but in which case you would be taking this material and pressing it in to create a part that's detailed. So just a different way to go about it. With the texture stamp, it's flexible, easy to press and apply, so that you can work that detailed surface information into a larger part. Before I show you the Habitat Flex I was telling you about, does anybody have any questions about the Habitat Black and the Habitat FR, the Fire Safe?
No, not really.
Okay,
We can
cool.
move on.
Okay, well, I want to show you that Flex because we were talking about it and we had that great question. And it's not going to be as flexible a material as some of our really soft rubbers, but it does have some impact resistance. And where this is really cool is if you had a habitat, for example, where like reptiles are grabbing onto it and they want a little bit of give, the Habitat Flex can offer you that little bit of impact resistance, so it's more likely to bend than break. You see that more in a thin section than a thicker section. These examples are actually made with the Flex as well, and you can see same material, very similar in color to the Habitat Fire Safe. But it still handles paint well. It's just with that little bit of flexibility. You want a paint that can flex a little bit too. It's, in this case, I just used an acrylic. I wanted to show you these because these are also PVC, like this one here. But in this case, I didn't use a texture stamp. I actually hand worked the surface with just a wet brush with isopropyl alcohol and shaped it. And then you can see how much of the paint actually picks up that level of detail. One of the things that are really neat about this, aside from the impact resistance, so if this is a railing and it was going to get handled a lot, it's more, it has a little bit of grip, a little bit more give. It's non-porous because it's an epoxy putty. So if you needed a surface that was easier to sterilize than a porous wood surface, but you still have that wood grain or wood texture, these can be a really cool way to do that. To simulate that effect either by making a texture stamp or by hand shaping. So this is what it looks like before the paint is applied, but that paint really pulls up that texture and can help enhance it even further. So this is the Habitat Flex. And actually, you know what? Just because I can, this is the reference that I used for the paint. So this is an actual piece of bamboo. So you can see it's porous and cut and split. This is the simulated one, which was just done by hand shaping techniques and texture techniques. All right. So did that answer the question earlier about that impact resistance? Okay, cool. Why don't we move on to those texture stamps? And if you give me just a moment there, I want to take a look and see how those freeform the freeform air fast examples are that we just looked at. Let's see if those have cured up on us or are still flexible. Thanks, Heather. So, don't want to handle it if it's not fully cured without gloves, but I'm just going to put on one just for the moment. And let's see. So this one is still flexible. That's the freeform air that we mixed first. The combination, it's a little firmer, but there's still a little bit of flex. And that freeform air fast, that is rock hard. That's not going anywhere. So there's the difference there, is that you're really using time to help support your process with the materials. But being able to cure at room temperature means you don't have to expose those substrates to heat underneath. And that's a really cool thing. So let's put that away. And I will show you a little bit more about those texture stamps. Oh, let's flip this around. So if you guys do have questions, again, don't hesitate to reach out to our support team here at Smooth On, either through email or over the phone. And to review those products we just took a look at, we're looking at examples made with the Habitat Black. We mixed up some Habitat Fire Safe, and we looked at some cured examples with that Habitat Flex FR, and we used the folding powder to help thicken that so that it was more shapeable and easier to apply and less adhesive to our surfaces. But when working with those materials, we wanted more control over what those surfaces look like, and to do that, we had stamps to help facilitate that. Now, I have actually some different materials here to be able to show you on how to make those stamps, the type of stamps you can do. There are times where you might only want one kind of focus point as opposed to a repeatable texture. Can I have that black example there that was on that last table? So instead, thank you, Heather, instead of a repeated example, this one actually has that focus point, and I want to see if I can do this. I prepped just a little bit of acrylic paint. We're going to see if this works like magic so it can show you where that focus texture is. I'm going to use a dry brush technique. This is just some acrylic white and acrylic brown. I'm going to see if I can highlight that focus texture so that you can see this fossil reveal itself. So this example, I feel like I'm an archaeologist working backwards. This example was just the Freeform Habitat Black, and then it was stamped with a stone texture and stamped so repeatedly all across to make it look like a stone matrix, and then a focus stamp that you see here was just pressed into that surface once to add interest. So in this case, it's just a single fossil that it's simulating, but remember, this is an epoxy putty, and it was just manually shaped this way to create the illusion. And I just used some acrylic paint, very paintable, very easy to paint without any primer or anything, just to kind of highlight that. So can you see that okay? I'm going to tilt it just a little bit toward the screen so you can see where that fossil sort of pops off. And so there's a lot of different paint techniques that can help accentuate your texture. But let's take a look at how to get that texture in the first place and what these stamps are. I'm going to move that back out of the way. Thank you. These are Rebound 25, as I mentioned. This is a brushable platinum silicone system. So you start with the texture that you're looking to reproduce. And then in order to make these stamps, the orange ones that you see here, they were actually brushed on a surface. I do recommend checking out the Thyvex thickener if you're looking to make the brush-on silicone stamps, because it can allow you to create thicker layers faster when you're creating that stamp, so that you don't have to do as many thin layers to build up your thickness. The Thyvex can be really cool for that. But we also have a product that's a putty. I actually think I'm going to mix some of that for you right now. The Equinox series is really versatile. It's a part A and part B silicone. And unlike a brushable material, this one you press and mix similar to the epoxy putties, only this is a platinum silicone putty. I want to show you what that looks like. So we've got the A, we've got the B, and it's also 1-to-1 by volume. Now, the putty is not going to capture quite as much detail from the surface as the brush-on, because the brush-on Rebound will allow you to get really thin on that detailed surface coat, but it works pretty fast so that you can make your mold all at one time, or your texture stamp. So I've got my A and I've got my B. I'm just going to press those together. And then I can press this against a surface. And I've got a great surface to work with. Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely use that one. I've got another coral example here. We'll close these up. The reason I wanted you to see this in its gel state, its flexible state, is because we've got some cured examples here that are still flexible. But I wanted you to understand why the Equinox examples were a little different and a little firmer than the Rebound. And then we're going to pour a texture stamp before we finish up today. So, just mixing that A and B. And this one in the series is the 35, which is the fastest setting one, so I'm going to work pretty quick. So I want to make sure I have a complete mix here. Smooth out that surface a little bit, and then I'm going to press it against a cured freeform habitat fire-safe example to capture that texture. So I'm not doing in this case, I just want a little bit of that texture. Now, if my surface is porous, like let's say I was applying this against a wood, I might need to seal that wood first. We have a really cool sealer, Super Seal, can actually be rinsed off some surfaces. In terms of an option, if you didn't want a permanent surface change necessarily to that, but just to close off the porosity, that's a really good one. We have a sealer and release agent reference guide on our website that you can check out that has recommendations too, depending what those different substrates are. But this is a non-porous epoxy putty, so it's fully cured, and I can use that without applying anything on the surface first. And then we'll see how this cures up, and go ahead and pour a fast-setting pourable platinum silicone. So I start with my original surface. In this case, I have a great example about those textures as to why you might be using that texture stamp. So I've got a pumpkin here that doesn't have a lot of detail, right? You see the shape and the curvature, but this doesn't look very believable. Compared to the texture of an actual one, now this one is starting to kind of decay and end its life, and it has all kinds of really interesting information. So I brush it with the Super Seal, especially with like that porous texture up at the top, and then I brushed on layers of Rebound to create a flexible stamp. Now, I don't need to brush on mold. I don't have any support behind this. I just want that texture so that I can press that information into a surface. This is a 25 Shore A hardness, so you see that flexibility. It still has some of that curvature, which might make it challenging to press against the surface, which is why you see a lot of these textures are flat, depending on the shape of what you're applying it to. But the Equinox that we just mixed, it's a 35A, so compared to that flexible 25, that's actually firmer, so when I go to shape it, it's going to hold its dimension stability a little bit better, but it's not going to flex as easily if I want more shaping control, and that's a personal preference in terms of figuring out your hand feel. In terms of the chemistry, the silicone, it's not as adhesive, it doesn't want to stick as much to those epoxy surfaces, which make it a really good option for working your texture in. And once you have that, you can use that stamp of your texture to make a model. That model can be used to make a mold, and that mold can be used to make many, many, many stamps, so that many hands can work on the same piece and get that consistent information. And that's why we're going to pour one right now. We're going to pour it, let's see, from our Mold Star series. This is our Mold Star 19T, which is very rapid setting. And it's a platinum silicone that's translucent in appearance. I want you to be able to see these two sides go together. So I'm actually going to add just a little bit of colorant into it, one side, so that you can see when they mix. So this is the Silk Pig Electric. So it's a silicone pigment. It's compatible with the silicone. So I'm going to add a very little bit, because a little bit goes a long way. Actually, I'm just going to put it right in the part B here.
Before you move forward with that, one question was about using Rebound with Equinox as a backer, for example.
Okay.
Is that something that you'd recommend?
So that's a great question. The question is, can you use the Equinox as a backing for the Rebound 25? So they are platinum silicone. So in terms of compatibility, the platinum to platinum, they generally want to bond. However, different products have different properties. Like, you know, even though the silicone has very low shrinkage, when you're combining two different materials, you could have distortion if they have different properties between the two. I personally wouldn't recommend that. One of the reasons is that the differences in that surface, like that cracking that can occur when you press it against your surface from the hand pressure. Now we do offer a firmer rebound material if you wanted to do a small scale test to see if it's suitable for you. That's our Rebound 40. So that would be a higher durometer, so it could add a little bit of dimensional stability with the Rebound in a brushable option where you could thicken it so you could get more thorough coverage. Again, you know, it depends how you want to approach it, but typically if you were looking in that direction anyway, I'd recommend staying with a higher durometer material versus layering it, just from my personal experience, so that I have a more consistent hand performance. But again, it's up to you. If you're thinking about doing that, I'd recommend testing it on a small scale first, and I want to let you know there is a firmer Rebound option. So before I go further with that, what I will say is these stamps are very different. This stamp has a greater thickness because it has a higher relief. This stamp has an extremely high relief. So that is a much thicker material. So it is going to perform differently even though it's the same hardness because there's more silicone there that the pressure is going against the surface. So I'd say if you are looking to do that small scale test, try it in the thickness you're looking for because different textures might have different properties to actually working with them. Okay, so I have a little bit of color here so that we can see when these two sides go together. And then this mold that was made is actually a urethane mold. This is a really unique urethane rubber called Compat 45. It does not inhibit this MoldStar product so that I can actually pour the MoldStar 19T into a flexible mold without needing a release agent. These two are compatible. So I'm going to go ahead and mix this. Give us a little bit of room. Let's see, grab a different one. And this is a 1-to-1 bi-volume platinum silicone as well. So in this case, I'm pouring it though, I'm not hand mixing it, and I want to be really thorough. When I mix, I'm going to be scraping the sides and the bottom of the container. And this is to show you how you can take a master and make many stamps. This is similar, it's a little more flexible than the Rebound 25. It's a 19, short A hardness. And I have some cured examples that I can show you. But this is going to set up so quickly that we can move forward, and we are going to demold this at the end of our presentation so that you can see it go from a liquid to that firmer rubber and be ready for use. So I'm making sure to scrape the sides and the bottom. And I'm actually going to go ahead and double mix. I think I'm just going to use one of the ones similar to what we had before. I don't think I have another big one like this, but what this is going to do is help make sure that I don't have any unmixed material sticking to the sides or bottom of my container, and I'm getting as complete a mix as possible. Ooh, making a little bit of a mess, so I think I'm just going to stop there and set this off to the side for the moment. This is going to set up pretty quick on me, so I don't want to hesitate. Then I'm just going to pour to the lowest part of my form. And this is a needle technique where you're letting the material get real thin to help pop the bubbles on the way down. I'm actually going to move that line just a little bit. So the idea is that if you have more hands working in that 60 or 90 minute, depending what habitat product you're using, material, you can have more stamps so that people can help you out, especially if you're doing a really large scale piece. I'm going to show you a large scale piece in just a moment. I'm just going to move some of the material over the sides because this has a very fast pot life. There we go, just push that edge. And cure time so that we can keep moving. It's already starting to thicken just a little bit. The material is affected by temperature. We've got a lot of lights on here, so it's a little warmer than room temperature. But I tend to set these off to the side to be able to use as a test to see when my mold is ready to demold. All right, so let me show you those larger examples. Now this material we just poured, the Mold Star 19T. When I was saying it has a very fast pot life, you're looking at 3 minutes at room temperature, and the demold time is 12 minutes. So we're going to wait just a little bit longer so that it can end its pot life and cure time before we demold it. But these are cured examples made with the same material, so you can see it's very flexible. Now this texture stamp isn't one that was drawn from life. This is one that was actually sculpted and made for an architectural or design effect. So keep in mind that you have a lot of options when it comes to the textures that you draw from. And this one is much more subtle, very low relief. But you can still see that information there. And this is also with the Mold Star 19T. So we're just going to let that set up. Oh, here you go. Thank you. And I'm going to show you an example that's taken to kind of the next level. So we were looking at flat ones before, and where I was saying sometimes that flat texture is something. This was made with that same texture stamp that you see here that we're actually making right now. I have an example of it in Rebound, where it was applied on the surface and then worked. So that same texture is what you see repeated here. Now the reason that I can actually handle this example is this one was textured in freeform air. So this one is much, much lighter weight. Again, it doesn't quite capture the detail that the habitat would be, but I can lift it a lot easier. So this is actually a poultry wire with a burlap reinforced around the shape with epoxymite. So because that epoxymite is compatible with the epoxy putties, it could be used to make a very organic shape come together, and then the thickness was applied, it was mixed and applied, and stamped with the same texture stamp that you see here in isopropyl alcohol, and then more material was actually sculpted on top to create lichen, and it was painted with acrylic paint, so you can see unpainted side, painted side. So this allows you a lot of versatility in that weight distribution. And that one has no armature inside of it. It's hollow except for the outer contours of that form, where for some of you who might be looking to shape that and push that even further, you might find it possible to remove the armature from the interior, whether you use a foam and then you actually use like an acetone, for example, to break it down and leave it hollow, or you just pull it out manually. So this guy here is a big baby made with a freeform habitat that was hand sculpted, and he was made in a similar to a ceramic process where it was newsprint as the framework to be able to work really big. Now he's a little heavier than what I was just holding, but I can still manage him compared to a very solid piece. So he's actually just the freeform habitat. After that initial layer was set up, then all the newsprint could be pulled out from inside because it was just used to create that shape and frame.
Janessa, before you move forward, you can move your mic down a little bit.
Okay.
That'd be perfect. Excellent. Thank you.
Sorry about that, guys. I hope it was still possible to hear what was going on. So I wanted to say with the texture stamps, whether you're making one, whether you're using a repeatable stamp, things to keep in mind are the depth of that stamp, the hardness of the material that you're working with. So like that Equinox that we applied earlier, it's already set up and ready to demold. So there's that texture right there. And that could save me all kinds of time where I normally might have to really sculpt that into a surface. Now it's ready to use and press. This one though, let's see, not quite there yet. We have a little bit more time before that sets up, and that's where I want to make sure everybody's questions get answered. If there's anything that anybody would like to know about these different materials that we've reviewed, we have the Freeform Sculpt product that we looked at, the Freeform Air series, as well as the Habitat series, and then we have different options for creating texture stamps for you to be able to use and make your shapes and surfaces. So was there anything else that anybody wanted to know?
I think we're covered.
Wow.
Yeah.
You guys are good. In terms of the materials and how they work, I will say that there's no real limit in terms of how large. There's a really phenomenal piece here at Smooth On that's made with a Habitat Black. We have some incredible dragons here at the Reynolds Advanced Materials store locations that are made with a range of these different putty materials that go across multiple stories. So I will say that if you're looking for something under different conditions, whether it's going underwater or it's being used, in that case, you know, whether it actually breathes steam, you don't have any issues with once that material's cured, it actually being exposed to that moisture. So in terms of, that's why they're really popular for the habitats and for the aquariums. But then again, you know, that detail getting really, really small, you could actually use that whether it's like detailed figure sculpture or jewelry sculpture or fine art. It really just, you have a real gamut that you can use these materials for. I'd say if there's one thing that I really look for, it's the effect and how I can go about it. That the best advice I have is to practice on a small piece. Give yourself a maquette or a test piece to be able to sculpt a smaller one before you invest more significantly and scale up to a larger size. I'm looking to see, we have a little bit more time before we set that up, but in terms of the examples that we saw here and the materials that we have to offer, I'm going to show you one technique that's a slightly more advanced technique. Can I have that mold on the table there? There are times where I might actually use them to supplement, to add to my process. So this is actually a shell that was made. So this is similar to the masks you saw before. This is that epoxy coat gray. So in terms of a mask, this is, you know, this is one of the more famous masks as far as they come. The example, the tool was made with the epoxy coat out of this mold. But what I wanted to show you is that this mold was made with a different brushable material. It was actually made with shell shock, which is a smooth-on product that's a urethane system. The seam on the shell, so I hadn't shown you a two-part shell yet. I wanted to show you that the seam itself was hand sculpted with the Freeform Air. So even though the shell shock was used to make the mold, it's a really great way to make registration keys and pieces that actually, like, you have control on a multi-part mold, how they go together and connect. Because the putties are so adhesive, you can add them on and build up from there. We still have a little bit time of that texture stamp. I don't want to keep you guys waiting, but in terms of how the materials can be used to build and shape, I wanted to ask, is anybody out there a sculptor? Does anybody have any projects that they're looking to do that they'd like to know more about? I find this incredible. I was expecting just if there was anything else people want to know, but it sounds like everyone's questions have been pretty much answered.
Yeah, one of the questions was about actually using these materials for two-part support shells.
Oh, so that was great.
So when you're doing a two-part support shell, you'll have to actually concern yourself if you're using epoxy for release from itself. So what are your recommendations for release and for like doing keys and things like that in there?
That is a really, really good question. So that example that you saw wasn't keyed as much, but the question is about release agents for when the epoxy is against itself to create a multi-part support shell or a two-part support shell. The Ease Release 200 can be used. Now, there are recommendations on the release agent for each epoxy system, so I absolutely recommend checking out that technical bulletin. Sometimes I like to use the Sonite wax to actually create a kind of a physical barrier as well. If I can't spray it, because there's sometimes where I might it might be challenging to actually spray into that surface. There is also the Ease Release 205. But if you can spray it against the surface, the Ease Release 200 and the Sonite wax work really well together as well. Now with the keys, because these are rigid, I can say this: when you have a rigid mold or a rigid form and you're taking that out, if you have a rigid against a rigid surface, you have a very high potential for a mechanical lock. Because they're rigid, they're not going to bend or flex. And so that's something to keep in mind. Like you saw, so I have another mold. This is that one-part mold that you were looking at. This one is actually keyed up on the sides. So the mold itself, I'm going to overturn this so you can see it. This was a dragon skin mold. So the keys were cut into it, and then the freeform air, when it was pressed around it, didn't stick, but it created a mechanical connection to help that register. And because this casting has a lot of deep undercuts and details, it was really helpful to use a flexible material because you don't want this to get stuck demolding out of your rigid one. So when you're thinking about that and doing your tests with your mold, you want to make sure that you you don't lock your model into your support shell. And that's where having the support shells that actually separate. Let's look at that two-part one more time. I want to show you kind of my rule of thumb for where I look for that material. I want my shell to be able to come away, to pull away without catching on anything in the direction that I'm looking to separate it from. All right. I was going to say, if we find we need just a little bit more time, we can actually mix up. Would you guys like to see that metal powder being mixed into one of the putties so that you can see what that looks like in that process? It's a little different than the liquid when it mixes in, so I can show you a little bit of how that looks.
Before you go there, actually, somebody had asked about preparing tree bark for a texture stamp.
Okay, great.
Because of the tree that you had showed there before.
I would be happy to review that. So the question is, in terms of preparing tree bark for making a texture stamp, so similar to the example that you see here and similar to the example that you see there. I will say it's a little different if you're actually working, against a live tree versus working against a section. Now, typically with that, it's a lot easier if you can bring your texture into a controlled environment in terms of temperature and also preparing that surface. So that preparation for sealing the wood that I was recommending taking a look at is the Super Seal. I'm going to go ahead and hand this back to you. Thank you. I'm good for right now. You can see that some of the bark actually came away in the stamp. This is one of the reasons I was showing this one, because I used this one directly off that wood surface, and there was a little bit of curvature there, but it was very slight. And And then when I cast into it, that first casting that I did, if it pulled off any of that bark that was kind of embedded in mechanically, I could clean that up so that I got a piece that was non-porous that I could just apply the silicone against. Because when I do that, when I apply the silicone directly against the plastic, because it's non-porous, I don't have to seal this. I don't have to release this. Generally, with a non-porous plastic, the use of a sealer or release agent is optional. This casting is actually made with the Smooth Cast urethane, the Smooth Cast 320, which is off-white in appearance. And then I use this as my master to make new molds to be able to make repeatable stamps. And this one is almost ready for us, but not quite. I do have an example of it so you can see it without the color. I do have one here. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it on film, but to be able to see that flexibility. And then that's how this piece here is going to cure up. And we're almost there.
You could actually show some of that metal powder. I think some people would be interested in seeing that mixed in.
I thought because it's not a liquid, it's a dry
Right.
powder, that's something that's really unique. I've never actually seen that done anywhere else. I've only ever seen that done in casting, so I wanted to show you that just a little bit. Well, we had a moment to be able to do that while this is setting up. And then this process, it's a little different. I'm actually going to work on top of a container because I don't want to waste my metal powder. So I'm going to move these off to the side. And I'll show you what this looks like so that you can replicate it yourself if you find that you're looking to sculpt at room temperature. Because normally when you're working with metals, you're talking about a foundry process unless you're cold casting. And this gives you an alternative at room temperature that's very different. So that freeform air fast that we mixed before, I'm just going to grab a little bit more of it. I don't want to do it off screen. I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. But I'm not going to grab too much this time because I want more time to shape it. So I'm just going to grab the A and B. And once I mix that together, I'm losing pot life, which is why I'm not doing too much. Typically with this, I do very small batches, especially because the metal powder itself is more costly. It's actual bronze. And similar to what I did with the liquid colorant before, I actually just pour a little bit in. And you can see that coloration. So I actually, it might just be because of the experience with the folding powder, I use the container to pick up extra so I have as much covered on the surface area as possible. And then I just mix it in until I have the color blend that I'm really looking for. I do have an example. One of the questions here, for those of you who might have used our materials before, would be, can you use any other powders, such as our Cast Magic series, for example? It depends on the size of the powder. Because the material itself is opaque, the very, very fine powder of the metal powders actually change the coloration. Where I would not recommend it with the Cast Magic, I do have an example I can show you how the effect isn't going to be as uniform as blending it in. So you can see this is a little different than the liquid colorant system, but it does give you that really, really beautiful metallic appearance when you're done. So if you're working in small batches with the fast, it's going to be much easier for you to mix up. If you want more time to work with it, that's where I'd say use the regular freeform air, but I wanted to be able to show you. I don't like wasting the powder because it's actual metal, so it actually polishes and patinas, and that's why I work with a closed container environment so that as I mix it, I can use as much of that powder as possible. So I'm actually thinking we could press this into one of the molds that we have here, and then we can demold our texture stamp, and if there are any additional questions, we can address them before we finish up today. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. I really hope you got some good tips and tricks out of how these epoxies work and ways you can use it for your project. And you can see that's just how I mixed that metal powder in, and now I have a bronze-infused epoxy that I can use again for a whole lot of different things, even if it's just cleaning up a cold casting, or whether it's something that I'd be looking to wear or create an emblem with. I'm just going to go ahead and press this right in to that stamp that we made before. And then I use a steel wool to polish it up, although you can paint it too, and that'll be set up for us in no time. I'm just going to close that off so I don't make a mess when I pull out this texture stamp for you guys. Well, that was neat. I was glad I got to show you something a little extra there. And this guy is ready to go. So this is that Moldstar 19T. And out of the compact mold. And it's gone from a liquid to a solid so that we can go ahead and texture our surfaces. So I can make many of them quickly to prepare for a large form like something the size of a tree, or a theming application that was very, very big. So there we go. That was a little bit of everything about how you can make your own tools you can use, and the way that these epoxy putty tools work. From our freeform series, the Sculpt, the Air, the Habitat, and our platinum silicone rubbers, from the putties to the pourable and brushable options. So if anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Again, I'm Janessa. We have an incredible team here at Smooth On, and we all be happy to help answer your questions through our email ticketing system or over the phone. And I hope you got some helpful information here today. Did we have any other questions that anybody wanted to know?
I think we're okay for now. Yep.
All right. Well, we're going to finish up here then.
Oh yeah, Milo's video coming up that's in 1 week.
Oh yeah, we've got good news there. We have an exciting YouTube live event with Milo. Please come check us out here at Smooth On next week. I believe it's multi-part mold making with Milo, so we're excited about that there. Guys, thank you so much. I hope you had fun. I'm really glad you came to check us out today. Good luck with your projects.